ago that, well, logical empiricism is starting to be, well, sort of invited back to the table of contemporary empiricism, which is sort of nice because they were sort of exiled for a while. So I take my brief basically to give not the latest from dusty archives and elaborate reconstructions of obscure footnotes, but to give you somewhat of a run-through overview of why logical empiricism isn't really such that empiricists have to be embarrassed by that association. So in order to do that, I want to kind of focus on the empirical basis, how the empirical basis of science was understood by Schlick, Carnap, and Neurot. And I shall make the following claims, namely that these empiricists were not naive sensualists, they were not wedded to a phenomenalist base, and they were not epistemological foundationalists. And positively, I want to claim that among them was a naturalist whose account of the observational basis of scientific knowledge claims did not just admit, in principle, so to speak, the social nature of the scientific enterprise, but who spelled out in detail the cooperative construction of bona fide empirical evidence. All right, so if any of these, or if all three of these claims are true, one thing follows, that they can't really have been as rabid reductionists as they are often characterized. So the first thing to note then is, well, is to make a kind of a little sort of historiographical homily, namely to say that we must regard, when we look at what these logical empiricists sort of said, or rather wrote, we must guard against sort of reading their terminology as we would read these terms nowadays. And one typical example of that is reduction or reducibility. As you know, you'll find them talking about reduction left, right, and center. Now, the intended application of that, however, was first of all not ontological, but epistemological. And secondly, and that's the point I'd like to make, is that the intended effect was not to be reductive, to reduce something to simply something else, but simply to establish responsiveness to evidence for the propositions that may be in question. So as a witness, I here would call on Carnap's so-called reduction sentences from actually 1936 and 1937. They only establish conditional evidential bearings on low-level theoretical terms like dispositions, and they forswear eliminative definition. And Carnap was very clear that he doesn't, precisely that's why I introduced him. At this point, he sort of said, we cannot define disposition terms in observational terms. And yet, he called them reduction terms. So I think that sort of suggests that it is not the nothing but reduction that was at issue. Another term that drives in this direction is the term physicalism. Again, nowadays we think of it as an ontological thesis, but for the logical empiricists, Carnap, etc., it really was a metalinguistic term. The intended effect was, again, to ensure that the evidence base for scientific claims was intersubjectively available, because it claimed, as a metalinguistic thesis, physicalism claimed that all the languages of all the sciences were translatable into, well, broadly speaking, the physicalist language. And by that, Carnap meant at first the language of mathematical physics, which was stretching it a bit, but then he settled on the everyday thing language, which spoke of observable objects, observable features, properties, and observable events. So the general moral, so to speak, of this thought seems to be, to me, that for the logical empiricists, the main focus of their activity lay on ensuring the epistemic accountability of science. Okay, now if we put this out as, so to speak, my thesis, of course, there are immediately two challenges that will be raised to that, right? Prominent counterexamples to the claim that the Viennese logical empiricism was not interested in foundationalist reductions. And the first one turns on Carnap's Aufbau, and the second will typically turn on Schlick's paper, The Foundations of Knowledge, 1934, Aufbau, of course, very early 1928. And the objection will run basically, look, did these people here, Carnap in the Aufbau, Schlick in Foundations, didn't they ensure epistemic accountability, try to ensure that precisely by the strict reductionism I just tried to discount, namely by nailing knowledge down to a secure base in sense experience? And the answer to this is no, simply no. It's not true that they did that, even though it is true that there is a certain undeniable reductionism in play in the Aufbau. Carnap gave it up very soon afterward. And there is also a certain very peculiar form of foundationalism in the late Schlick. And I'll explain both of those sort of points. But neither amounts to reductionist foundationalism. So if Carnap in the Aufbau shows a certain amount of reductionism, fine. Schlick shows a certain type of foundationalism, fine, but that doesn't boil, that doesn't come together to kind of the reductionist foundationalism that is often alleged against the Vienna Circle. So the moral that follows from that is that, as far as I can see, logical empiricism is best understood in terms of the trajectory of its theoretical development over its lifetime, and not as defined wholly by early programmatic statements, like, for example, the Aufbau, and then taken to be confirmed by certain tangential sort of expressions along the way, like Schlick's 1934 paper. Anyway, and that long-term trajectory, I think, is best understood as these guys, certainly Carnap and Neurot, aiming towards a comprehensive but non-reductive naturalism. All right, so that's the broad picture, but as I said, what do we do with those two challenges here? What do we do? So let's look at Schlick's non-foundationalism, as I would say. And again, I can't give you the full chapter and verse of it, although I'd be happy to refer you to where you can find it. But in outline, nevertheless, this is the story. What is the story? Surely Schlick's 1934 paper certainly looks like, well, he talks about the foundations of knowledge. In fact, he literally talks about that, and he uses the term affirmations to seem to point to that. And when you read this paper by Schlick, Schlick does read a little bit like Chisholm, so unsurprisingly, you find that, you know, he was chided for his foundationalism by Sellers in Empiricism and the Philosophy of Mind. So, however, what were those affirmations? Well, affirmations for Schlick were statements that describe phenomenal experience, like the notorious "read here now," and they're incorrigible as long as they are made sincerely. And then therefore they're the only class of synthetic statements where understanding of their sense coincided with the recognition of their truths. And in that respect, these affirmations are like analytic statements, but they're not analytic because they state a fact, a phenomenal fact, right? So for Schlick, then, affirmations are sui generis. They are a category of statement very much of their own, and they're extremely peculiar, by the way. Those of you who remember reading the paper, he says these things actually cannot even be written down, because once they're written down, there would be a proper proposition, and they have, so strange stuff, right? Anyway, so what do? Affirmations, they employ indexical expressions that are irreplaceable by coordinate expressions or proper names, and their use of the descriptive expressions they employ is constrained only by the user's intentions at the time, not by past not by how the term was used in the past. And that's precisely what brings up a problem. Because given, on the one hand, that indexical expression, etc., that they can't be replaced, and on the other hand, that the use of descriptive propositions is not constrained by prior usage, the affirmations can't do what they were apparently meant to do if they were to serve as epistemological foundations for our scientific knowledge. Namely, they cannot give subjective certainty as well as provide the objective legitimation that scientific knowledge claims require, right? So in a way, so Schlick's theory of foundations sort of simply misfires in that respect, and that various people have pointed that out to him. And however, Schlick wouldn't budge. He would say, this is it, and he sort of went with it. And well, my question is, or my thought is, it's simply implausible that the very first philosopher who knowledgeably dealt with Einstein's theory of relativity did not notice this obvious disconnect between what looks like his epistemology of science and, you know, the scientific practice, right? So an alternative explanation is required, and Schlick begins to give one, although he doesn't really fully do that, and a long story has to be soldered. But Schlick gives us one hint, and the hint Schlick gives us is he says that these affirmations he talks about are not the same as the protocol statements, the recordings of, you know, experimental outcomes, etc., that scientists use in their everyday practice, nor do these affirmations stand in determinate logical relations to any of these, any of the propositions of ordinary scientific discourse? I take it that this is the best hint we can get from Schlick, that really, if they cannot stand in these logical relations, and if they're not identical, well, surely, you know, well, their job cannot be, if they have a job at all, to give epistemological foundations to scientific knowledge. They must have some kind of other job. And my answer to this, and I can only tell you now, later on I can refer you to paper I have on that, I'm afraid. What Schlick up to? Well, the affirmations he talked about are instead meant to deal with external world skepticism. Now, that's an issue Schlick himself had dealt with already in his habilitation in 1910, and again in his General Theory of Knowledge of 1918. But what these affirmations were meant to do is to deal with that old problem, which he often refers into that problem, the old problem of knowledge, in a radically new way, which Schlick thought he had learned from his interaction over the years in the early 1930s with Wittgenstein in conversation, and which he learned from Wittgenstein by Wittgenstein lending him manuscripts, like, for example, the Big Typescript. So Wittgenstein so Schlick was au fait with the middle Wittgenstein and the Wittgenstein's turn to meaning as use and this whole kind of stuff, much before the rest of the sort of philosophical world. And from that, Schlick sort of distilled the affirmations as a kind of a praxeological response to philosophical skepticism. Here there were these, well, propositions which aren't quite propositions, but where we can be assured of our embedding in the world, that we haven't gone wrong. And once we have that, as he says, the light of knowledge sort of goes on, switches on. So in other words, for Schlick, scientific knowledge itself continues to be as fallible and foundational as it is for his colleagues. Its regular justification does not depend on these phenomenalist affirmations. Okay, that's the story for Schlick. What do we do with Carnap? Well, Carnap, as you recall, Carnap's Aufbau sought to demonstrate both the unity of empirical science by showing that all of the object domains are comprehensible in one language, And that, as he put it, even though the subjective origin of all knowledge lies in the context of experiences and their connections, it is still possible to advance to an intersubjective, objective world which can be conceptually comprehended and which is identical for all observers. So the aim is, Carnap's aim was to show, to demonstrate how the conditions of the possibility of objectivity can be met. And you will recognize, of course, this is a line of reinterpretation of Carnap's Aufbau that has been put forward by Michael Friedman and Alan Richardson very sort of comprehensively and convincingly, I think. I won't go through their whole story of that, but just show how one can how this reading can accommodate a certain reductionism which we nevertheless find in the Aufbau. So first of all, what's the claim? The claim is that Carnap's claim in the Aufbau was that what matters for objectivity is not the relation that knowledge claims bear to what they're about, that matters for their truth, but rather what matters for objectivity is that their content is expressible in purely structural terms, or is constituted in purely structural terms. Content was constituted without any reference to intersubjectively inaccessible manifestations of subjectivity, be that either intuitions or some kind of meanings which reach out beyond the experience itself. So that was the, as it were, objectivity program, quasi-Kantian, of the Aufbau. Yet it's true that the Aufbau was at the same time somewhat reductive, because Carnap talks about constitution, that's the Kantian term there, and that's defined as a reduction of a concept to more basic concepts. And thus he says, because of the transitivity of reducibility, all objects of the constitution system are thus indirectly constituted from objects of the first level. So we're talking about a pretty radical reductionism, such that in the program, at least, we go from physical objects all the way down to, well, the very basic objects of the constitution system, which were as yet whole unanalyzed experiences. And then the question is, well, with this reductionism, well, why this reductionism if he wasn't a foundationalism? And the answer to this, I think, is that the reduction of all scientific concept formation to just one type of basic element, the elementary experience, and one basic relation, remembered similarity, and even then the further structuralization of that basic relation, that this would allow the demonstration that, as he put it, scientific statements speak only of forms without stating what the elements and the relations of these forms are. So in other words, the structuralization, the showing that objectivity is possible, even though we start from a subjective starting point of methodological solipsism, that we nevertheless can arrive at objective knowledge, that requires structure, the whole structuralization of our conceptual evidence edifice, and that is done precisely because Carnap can reduce all propositions down to just these endless, unspeakable sort of iterations of basic relation and basic elements. Here he says this transformation is not only possible, but it's imperative for science to speak about what it speaks about what is objective, and whatever does not belong to the to the structure, but to the material is in the final analysis subjective. So reductionism is in the program there for Carnap without foundationalism, all right? That was the Aufbau. Of course, then soon Carnap drops this whole methodological business in his protocol sentence debate with Neurot, and then in the logical syntax, he adopts both holism, as you can see there. The test applies at bottom not to a single hypothesis, but to the whole system of physics as a system of hypotheses, and a radical revisability. There's Carnap, all ruled, no rule of the physical language is definite. This applies not only to the P rules, but also to the L rules, including those of mathematics. So there is Carnap, 1934, about, well, allowing revisability across the entire, if you want to talk with Quine, entire conceptual drum. So going on to his physicalism, what about his physicalism? The Aufbau started with an obviously phenomenalist perspective. Carnap abandoned the phenomenal base methodological solipsism for good in testability and meaning. In between, where he called the phenomenal language a purely subjective one, so suitable for soliloquy only, while the intersubjective thing language is suitable for use amongst different subjects. And that's a change insofar as prior in late 1932, he finally, after the urgent of Neurot, sort of adopted the view that, well, you can do epistemology without methodologic solipsism, but it's possible. You can still do it. By now, in 1936-7, methodology, testability and meaning, he said, you know, forget the methodological base. If you want to reconstruct the language of science, that has to be intersubjective, and we can't do that, right? So, and at that point, Carnap defined the base, the empirical base of science as that can be, as it were, the propositions that use observable predicates, and that these are predicates for observable objects, features, properties, and events. And he said, you asked me what observable is? Well, let me pass you on to the behavioristic theory of language, he said. So like a good naturalist here already, he points us to the scientists. So any phenomenalism long left behind. What about his empiricism? Well, again, in 36, 37, he makes a very interesting move. Namely, he first of all says, look, I understand empiricism not in the narrower sense of sensationalism or in any way that restricts empirical knowledge to certain kinds of experience. Rather, he says, I take empiricism to constitute a proposal, namely that as empiricists, we require that the language of science be restricted in a certain way. We require that descriptive predicates and hence synthetic sentences are not to be admitted unless they have some connection to possible observations, a connection that has to be characterized in a suitable way. Okay, now, characterizing that in a suitable way is a not inconsiderable homework, but never mind that for the moment. Note that for now, Carnap's empiricism is not a truth-valuable doctrine about the origin of knowledge anymore, but a proposal to employ a certain kind of language in scientific discourse. And as such, as a proposal, it, of course, confronts us with what he later would call an external question. And the adoption of that proposal and saying, yes, let's be empiricists, is to be assessed not in terms of that's true to reality, but rather in terms of the practical utility. There, Carnap would serve the practical utility of empiricism, or using an empiricist language, is the predictive and explanatory power we get from it, and not unimportant at all for him, the cognitive transparency and the epistemic accountability that this affords us. Okay, so this is now Carnap's, if you like, mature empiricism. Let's move over to Neurot. I hinted at Carnap's New Kantian background and his debate with Neurot. I said, well, once he gave up on methodological solipsism, at least for practical purposes. So he dropped that which was central to the Aufbau. We might ask, well, did he drop his concern with objectivity likewise? And there the answer is no. As Carnap stressed in the 1930s, it was a supreme advantage of the physicalist language that it was intersubjective, that it afforded real intersubjectivity and not merely simulated it as the as the Aufbau did, and that it sort of thus rendered science possible. And we can take it objectivity. So I take it then that Carnap's interest in what allows for objectivity had not really changed at all, but he no longer located the possibility of objectivity, so to speak, in the logical structure of the contents of individual consciousnesses as represented in the Aufbau, which are then assumed to be shared across the species. No, now Carnap located the possibility of objectivity in the logical structures of public languages. At first in 32, mathematical physics, but then 36, 37, he basically in the everyday thing language. And note that this suggests a certain answer to the question whether the concern with objectivity, as Carnap showed it in the Aufbau, is necessarily of a Kantian nature, because here we find Neurot saying the possibility of science becomes apparent in science itself. And well, you can call many people a Kantian, but I think Neurot certainly kind of not. So what we get there is that by the late 30s, by the mid 30s, I would think both Carnap and Neurot are agreed that the conditions or for the possibility of objectivity, or let's forget that phrase, that how to account for the objectivity of science, well, we have to look at the procedures that go into scientific reasoning, scientific thinking, scientific arguing, namely the whole structures that are evident in evidence-guided intersubjectivity. And in this program of looking at science in this way and objectivity of science, Carnap and Neurot observed a certain division of labor. Carnap stuck with the logic of science, Neurot did the pragmatics of science. So whereas Carnap did what Carnap does and construct languages till the cows come home, Neurot did what he called the behavioristics of science. But later on Frank called the pragmatics of science. He investigated scientific practice. So by means of the empirical sciences of science, psychology, sociology, and history. So it's at that point that we get to Neurot's protocol sentences, right? He looks at the empirical basis, or with the help of these protocol sentences, Neurot looks at the empirical basis of science not as phenomenal states, and neither as merely a distinguished class of sentences, namely those that feature only observable predicates, but as certain acts of testimony. So let's look at his proposal. It's again, hey, on the first face of it, quite bizarre. He says a complete protocol might look like this. And it's a quote, a complete protocol might, for example, be worded like this, quote, Otto's protocol at 317, quote, Otto speak, or brackets, Otto speech thinking at 316, brackets at 315, there was a table in the room perceived by Otto, brackets, brackets, brackets. But then you look at that and everybody has said, look, Otto, what's all this about, right? Well, actually, he went on in the next sentence to say this factual statement is so constructed that after deletion of brackets, further factual statements appear, which, however, are not protocol sentence. Otto speech then thinking at 316, brackets at 315, there was a table, and further at 315. And later on, in fact, Neurot adds, splits it up even further to get 4 conditions. What was all this about? Well, the simple answer to that is that Neurot was concerned with a certain type of public statement, recordings of empirical evidence. What he does here is he gives a schematic representation of scientific testimony that tries to represent distinct acceptance conditions by different kind of brackets. So what he does here, he does not, for instance, or importantly, it would be a mistake to understand Neurot here as trying to give the truth conditions for first-person knowledge claims. He's not at all in that game. Rather, he gives acceptance conditions for third-person knowledge claims. When should I accept what you tell me you just saw? So The intention then of this strange structure of Neurot's was to render as explicit as possible the acceptance conditions of observational testimony. He wants to make transparent the interplay of different conditions which the acceptance of scientific testimony is subject to by iterated embeddings of an observation statement. So using his later thing where he has 4 elements, it can be schematized such that it's protocol bracket, there's a thought bracket, then it talks about a stimulation state of the organism, and then another bracket, and in the inside bracket it speaks about an observable fact. And when Neurot talks about the deletion of brackets, he talks about the decomposition like that, namely that first we have the whole lot, then we have got third, etc., etc. And the acceptance conditions for a protocol, when we can accept a protocol as, yes, somebody made this protocol, and we can therefore take it as a datum that this fact, there was a table in the room or whatever, was observed, and we can stick that in the data bank of science. The acceptance condition is this conjunction, condition 1, condition 2, condition 3, and condition 4. And if we look at it like that, even though conditions 1, 2, and 3 are obviously non-truth functional statements, nevertheless, the acceptance conditions with 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, that works like good old truth tables. Now, then, of course, one has to tell a story of what these conditions are. They are institutional conditions, and if you like, I can tell you a little bit more about this, but time is moving on, and I don't want to test your patience too much, but they are conditions that fix, as it were, that one observes the institutional requirements of science, that one has seen it, and so on, and negative conditions. So, wrapping up, I would like to say that what we've seen so far is that Schlick really was not a foundationalist with regard to scientific knowledge. He had these funny foundations, but that was to deal with something science does not, after all, deal with, namely philosophical skepticism. Likewise, Carnap was also not a epistemological foundationalist, neither in the Aufbau nor later, and he certainly was not wedded to phenomenalism in any kind of sense. And here, finally, that Neurot's theory goes, as it were, furthest away from the, as it were, traditional caricature of the logical empiricists, like good old British empiricists with a bit of logic on top, in as much as his theory sketch of testimony combines, on the one hand, normative determinations of acceptance conditions for observational testimony with a descriptive apparatus that tries to take account of both neurophysiological and psychological conditions of individual perception, as well as interpersonal and institutional conditions of scientific cooperations as pertains to the establishment of basic data. And upon a little bit of prodding from Carnap too, he was also happy to talk of his little theory sketch there as a proposal. And that, I think, takes us about as far away from the legend of simplistic logical empiricism as one can get. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks very much for that, Thomas. That was really, really interesting. So the way that we'll structure the questions is that if you type in the chat Q for question and F for follow up, and then I can just read them out as they come. We'll prioritize students if they have questions to ask, but please, everyone, do type Q if you do have a question.
Maybe if you're a student, write student in brackets, just so David knows.
Yeah, that would be helpful. Yep, Fons, you want to jump in?
Yes. Hello, Thomas. Thanks for the talk. I was interested in the way you characterized, well, Carnap's and Neurot's later version of empiricism, not as an assertion, but as a wait, what was your term? As in something that we should, as a normative proposal, as a proposal to go forward. And I was just